All right, guys. Now that the MGE and the wheel commander for the 9th generation have been released, we can actually talk about the investment strategy for caps. Okay, so the MGE commander is a garrison commander, not field relevant, so we're obviously not going to talk about her. And it's unironic that I have Belisarius on the screen as the top 4 here, because I do think he's either the 3rd or 4th best overall cap commander. Okay, but I'll present my case and then you guys can decide for yourself. So overview, we'll actually talk about open fielding. We'll simplify it into a simple formula because all these things we talk about, like rage, manipulation, debuff, buff, AoE, single target, really what you're talking about, really what you're simplifying it down to is just one thing. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about some factors that make a commander pairing good, right? Because you could have a really good commander, but if you don't actually pair that commander with the right commander, all of a sudden that commander that could be really good is actually losing a lot of their value. And 2 inferior commanders with good synergy could actually end up being a better march. So that's why I typically actually like talking about marches more than just commanders by themselves. Now, having said that, we will talk about Belisarius Prime. I'll kind of talk about all the stuff he does, simplify it down so we could kind of just evaluate him from a more like 10,000 feet view, a bigger picture. We'll present some thought experiments. So Einstein was very famous for this, right? Whenever he has a question that's very tough to solve, he'll actually think of scenarios where essentially scenarios where the question he has, you could present it in a scenario, and then because he's thinking about it through the context of a scenario, a lot of times questions that might be very complicated actually becomes very easy to understand. So we'll play around with that and try to present it in that way. And then finally, probably what most of you guys are here for is what should you do, right? If you are just getting into KVK 3, what should you do? If you already have 2 cab marches and your second cab march is Huo William, what should you do? Well, don't worry, we'll cover all of that. Okay, so first let's actually talk about open fielding. All these things, stats, skills, smite damage, buffs, debuffs, rage, manipulation, all it actually distills down to is you want to maximize the differential between the damage you're dealing to the damage you're taking. Okay, so for example, if you are dealing 200 damage and you're only taking 100, you're trading 2 to 1, then theoretically you could actually fight twice as many troops on the field and actually still be competitive, right? And actually the way this game works, the mechanics or the formula works, because damage scales with how much troop is available. If you're actually doing 2 to 1, you can actually fight more than twice as many troops on the field if you're trading 2 to 1 against them. Okay, so if you have a good buff, what is that doing? That's actually increasing your damage output. If you have a good rage manipulation where you're manipulating the enemy's rage, kind of like Belisarius, right? What you're actually doing is you're decreasing the damage that they're dealing. But ultimately what matters is you're taking how much damage you're dealing, how much damage you're taking, and then you want to make that differential as big as possible. And that's open fielding simplified. Okay, kind of like sometimes people with basketball. What's the purpose of basketball? Scoring more points than the opponent, right? That's kind of like the open fielding equivalent of simplifying really what the game is about. Okay, so factors that make a pairing good, right? So no commander has it all. Maybe besides Scipio, he actually probably does have it all, which is what makes him so good. And honestly, in my opinion, underrated when it first came out. I think people like Nevsky better, even though I thought Scipio was better. But even now, I still think it's very underrated. Okay, so if no commander has it all, then what you want is very good synergy between the two, where one commander can maybe shore up what the other commander doesn't have, or if one commander has something and then you pair him with another commander, it actually enhances what both commanders do. That's what synergy is. All right, so damage wise, just a note on a single versus AoE, right? So we all know Huo has a 2700 damage factor skill damage, right? It looks very impressive on paper, but if you compare that to say someone like William, who people consider his damage factor very low, is 1500 to 3 targets. If you're hitting 3 targets with 1500, you lose 15% for every additional target hit. So technically it's actually 1050 times 3. Huo, if he hits a target, it's 2700. If William is hitting 3 targets, technically it's actually 3150, right? So the damage per second, or the DPS on William, is just going to be higher, even though Huo's number is a lot more impressive. And this isn't even factoring in that William has a instant proc, right? And it can actually be 1,000 damage instant proc, or if you're actually surrounding a target, it could go up to 1,500. Technically, if you're not looking at anything else, just based on their damage output from their active skill and then the instant proc, William actually has higher DPS than Huo, which is why a lot of people just think AoE is king, AoE is king. Technically, not necessarily, right? Because if the single target damage factor gets high enough, then it'll actually have a higher DPS than the AoE. But for the most part, we don't have that yet in the game. Okay, now that's not to say that whatever number is higher is always better, because there is something to be said about if you could focus all your damage onto one target and you can melt that target really fast, that's probably a little bit more valuable than chipping away at multiple targets, but they're still on the field, applying their buffs and debuffs, and all that stuff, right? So that gets a little bit more nuanced and complicated, but this is just a presentation of the difference between single target and AoE and then the damage output. Right, obviously you want the March to be tanky enough, because if you're not tanky, you just melt right away. All the stuff you could potentially do, you can't do, right? Same thing with March speed. You could have all these other buffs, debuffs, damage, but if you can't connect to the target, or you're in a bad position, you can't get away and you get melted, then all that stuff doesn't really matter, right? So you need enough March speed, you need enough tankiness, which is why like a commander like XY, I'm just not high on at all anymore. And also really slow pairings. So like, for example, back in the day, like Kuang, Leonidas, even if that March, you gave it like 20% more stats, it's probably just not viable on the field nowadays, right? Buffs, debuffs, obviously, you could do health reduction, defense reduction for the enemy. You could manipulate the rage. Buffs for yourself, right? You can increase your skill damage. So like Nevsky, the secondary commander of Nevsky, gets like 60% extra skill damage. All these things are just ways to manipulate the base damage to actually amplify that output. So for example, very often these AoE commanders, especially on the Cav side, right? You look at William, you look at Joan, they do AoE, but they don't have any skill damage increase. Whereas Nevsky and Huo, or even Belisarius, they're a single target, but they actually have like a 60% skill damage increase, a 55%. These are all conditional, right? Or in Belisarius' case, it's a conditional 30%. Right? And then finally, right now in the game, there's no way to measure the group utility that a March brings, right? So in the NBA, right, you don't only measure points, you measure rebound, assist, steals, block, all these different stats. For the most part in this game, what we measure is kills and then deads, right? What's your KP? And then deads obviously factor into KP, but most of it comes from wounding the enemy. If there was a way to actually measure how much utility or how much a March is improving everyone else's reports, maybe it'll be valued more. But because of the way it is, and also it's more quote unquote like hidden benefit, even though a March could have great group utility, a lot of times it tends to be underrated. And just in general, just think about it this way, like March is even like Trajan Mulan, Trajan Ethel, like Belisarius debuff, because they're being applied to multiple allies, or if you're debuffing an enemy and like 5, 6, 7 Marches could hit the enemy, the group utility tends to actually add more open field value than just like doing more damage for one March. It tends to be that way, right? But human psychology, me included, right? I would just prefer to have one commander that's a lot better. Like I'm not running Trajan Mulan on the field, even though theoretically having one Trajan Mulan for every 5 Marches on the field will actually probably benefit your kingdom more than whatever 5th March you're running. I'm not doing that. So sometimes you do want to be a little selfish. Okay, so some general thoughts on Belisarius Prime. If I'm just taking the formula I presented earlier, maximizing the differential between damage dealt and damage taken, I think Belisarius as a commander would either be the 3rd or 4th best overall cav. I think top 2 is still Nevsky, Joan. And then the fight for 3rd would be between William and Belisarius. I know there's a lot of people that love Huo, and I will come off as like a Huo hater, but as far as benefiting everything overall is concerned, Huo is what you would consider a selfish March. Okay, and I will actually cover what a selfish March is. A selfish March, if I had to simplify it here though, is that even though the individual report might do pretty well, right? And Attila Takeda falls into that category as well. The group utility or the impact on everyone else's report isn't nearly as good. Okay, so it's frowned upon now for a lot of Imperium Kingdoms. If a player is using Attila Takeda, it's for that reason. Hua, for some reason, hasn't fallen into that category yet, but I think if you have better options that could benefit everyone more and you're still using Hua, technically you could call that a selfish march. But like I said earlier, sometimes you got to be a little selfish because fun factor is also a part of picking a march, right? So Belisarius, I think he has average damage. It's actually probably slightly below average just because even though his damage factor is pretty good, 2400, but it's only single target. And compared to all the commanders that could do AoE, it's actually probably on the lower side. His tankiness is also average, probably slightly on the lower side. 25% defense, 10% skill damage taken reduction, right? I mean, there's worse, but there's also a lot better. But his debuff is elite. Probably the best, maybe like for sure top 3, right? And that by itself will propel him ahead of a lot of the commanders that might have more stats and might have more damage output, and we'll actually go over why. And then finally, he actually plays a very unique role. He is the fastest commander of the game, right? Already has 20% march speed on a cav, but then when you exit combat, the 60% will make him really fast. So what he can do is all these marches that try to get away from you, he can actually stay attached or catch up and then slow one march down for everyone else to catch that march. And that's something, in my personal opinion, would be really fun for me to use. And that's something that we don't technically have a commander really suited for that role yet, right? Like obviously Kaz are really fast, but this guy is going to be on a whole another level of fast. And I think that will make it really fun. Just like for reference here, I think Hua Belisarius will be a very, very fun march to use. Do I think that will be the best group utility benefit on the field march? Probably not, but do I think that's probably the most fun pairing for Belisarius? I do think it is. Okay, so let's actually go over some thought experiments here, okay? So thought experiment 1, let's pretend we have 4 generic marches. They're all about the same, right? So they have 100 points of output, and then Hua is also doing 100 points of output, right? So in total, you get 500, okay? And let's just pretend Belisarius' output is only half of Hua. And we know that's not true, because if I ask anybody right now, if you took a Hua versus 2 Belisariuses, who do you think will win, or who do you think will produce more? I think most people would agree that 2 Belisarius would beat 1 Hua, right? So if that's the case, then Hua is not twice as good as Belisarius. But let's just pretend Belisarius is only 50 points and Hua is 100 points. But if you count his expertise as, hey, whoever you're attacking will deal 12% more damage. And I know there's all these factors. There's AoE, Hua's third skill is conditional, Belisarius' expertise is conditional on it being surrounded, like all that stuff, right? So we're just simplifying all this down. If March 1, 2, 3, and 4 are doing 12% more damage, so their output is increased by 12%, and then because you're surrounding, then Belisarius also gets an extra 12%. Even if Belisarius by himself is only half as good as Hua, which we know is probably not true, overall, if you combine the number of these two, the top would be 500, the bottom would be 510, right? And for most people, if you just present these numbers like emotionally unattached, they would take the second number. And Belisarius is not only half as good as Hua. So now if you look at the reports, right, whose report's going to be better? Hua's report or Belisarius' report? Probably Hua by a decent amount, right? And people will use that as a justification for why you should invest in Hua over Belisarius. But if you start looking at the other 4 marches, and the other 4 marches have a report that's 12% better, overall, the yellow will actually be doing better than the red. Okay, so that's just a thought experiment, just presenting my case for Belisarius. And I think it's actually pretty close to kind of what the debate people are having. All right, here's another thought experiment. If you had 1 Hua versus 1 Beli, who do you think would do better? Hua is going to do better than Belisarius, right? 2 Huas versus 1 and 1, who's going to do better? Probably I would still take 2 Huas. But if we expand that out, you have 10 Hua Cubines versus 9 Hua Cubines and 1 Belisarius. I think it's a slam dunk that the 9 and 1 would beat the 10, right? So you kind of see how that works. So Belisarius really starts benefiting from having other marches because that's what his expertise scales off of, okay? Now, let's just say
you were only running one march. Even if you were only running one march and it was Belisarius Prime, okay, maybe your report won't look as good, but it's not just 1v1 on the field. There's always a lot of other marches on the field. It's just that when you're benefiting other people's marches, you won't actually see that report. And, you know, we gotta all be a little selfish sometimes. It doesn't feel as good. Which is why I think for most players, if you don't have 5 marches, even though I could still make a case that Belisarius is probably more beneficial than Hua, but since you can't really see that on your own reports, right? If you want to make a case for investing in Hua, like go for it, but just know kind of what you're choosing between, okay? And this is really what a selfish, quote unquote, selfish march is that your individual report will look good, but when you're comparing how it benefits everyone else's reports, you're kind of choosing the individual report for that march over the overall benefit, right? And that's what a selfish march is. So hopefully this thought experiment kind of presents some concepts and helps you understand why the people that are excited about Belisarius are really excited about him, because he'll do okay in his trades, and I'll go over why in the next page. But really, it's the excitement is about what his debuff can help the overall murder ball and really your kingdom and your side or your coalition, whatever, however you want to measure that. Okay. So, what should you do? Let's actually go over how I would do the Cav March pairings. So if you're running one Cav March, I would do Nevsky Joan. If you're doing 2 Cav Marches, this is like pretending like you haven't invested in anything. I would actually do Nevsky William and Joan Belisarius. I do want to actually take a look at Belisarius William. So obviously the glaring weakness of Belisarius William is that now you're running a mobility tree as a primary. But what if you actually stack more speed, right? And you lose a little bit damage output. But now this march can kind of do what I talked about earlier, where it'll be able to, this will be the fastest march on the field. You'll be able to catch anybody. And William, if you remember, actually has a slow in his active skill. So now you can actually catch someone, slow them down. This march will actually probably trade all right too, because you're not always just staying connected. You're poking back and forth. Belisarius has a smaller instant proc. William has a slightly bigger instant proc. Belisarius still brings a conditional 30% skill damage increase. I think it'll trade all right. And then the utility, because of the buff of debuff of Belisarius, and the buff of William will be through the roof. Okay, so I don't know yet. I'm saying it as a possibility, but probably Nevsky William, Joan Belly, just to be safe. If you're getting to 3 marches, Nevsky Joan primary, Hua Belly, I already talked about that march, probably the most fun pairing for Belisarius. And then for the 3rd march, I would actually run William behind Justinian. This march is not going to do a lot of damage just because neither have skill damage increase, right? So even though the damage factor of Justinian looks pretty good, if you're not increasing the skill damage, then the damage output is just going to be mid. But at that point, what you're looking for is actually mostly William's utility that he brings with like okay damage, and then Justinian's very tanky, right? So having that march in the field will probably be the way I go for 3 marches. But again, I talked about this in a couple of videos now. I wouldn't run 3 marches of any troop type. I think if you're going to go to a 7th march, really that's when you should be going to 3 marches of a troop type, unless you're like really specializing or something. If you're going to 7 marches, I think it should be 2-2-2 and then a siege for the 3rd one. For the 7th march, I think over the next 6 months, you're going to see that become more and more prominent. I think Mr. Siege is doing a really good job of getting this siege hype out there, but also more and more people are starting to realize that these siege commanders, well, what they do is very, very valuable. Okay, if you're just getting into KVK 3, good news. If you're a mid spender or above, you can invest in Nevsky in the dailies, and then just get Joan from the wheel, and that's actually the first march you could wear on. You could work on, and you don't have to change anything up. If you're getting into KVK 3 now, you don't have to wait till May. You don't have to save your sculptures. You can actually just fire away and start investing. You'll still be Nevsky Joan as your first cap march. And then also, I talked about this earlier, but I'll reiterate it here. If you're running 4 marches or less, so you're not running 5 marches, and you want to be a little selfish, you want to just go Hua instead of Belisarius, that's fine. Your report for Hua is going to be better than probably the report for Belisarius. And at the same time, just kind of know as far as that debuff and the group utility and everything, benefiting other people's reports, it's not going to do as well. I just don't think it will be. But you could be a little selfish, right? It's not like I'm not going to blame you for it. I think if you are running 5 marches or more, your reports will actually reflect that, right? Because when you're controlling 5, 6, or 7 marches, you're going to be focusing on whichever target you're attacking, and then literally your other marches will benefit enough where I think it's pretty slam dunk that you should pick Belisarius over William. Now, a lot of people already have Nevsky Joan and then Huo William. So what should you do, right? Obviously, if you have 4 marches or less, I think probably just skip Belisarius, even though, again, he's probably actually providing more on the open field. But if you have 5 or more, I think if you're not ahead on gold heads, so you're still like, you just kind of got there, maybe you're in KVK 6, 7, maybe even KVK 8, where you're not quite ahead enough on the gold heads, and you want to skip Belisarius, that's probably a good way to go, because if you skip him, now you can get further ahead. It'll set you up in the future. One thing in this game, you really don't want to start backwards investing. So a commander came out like 8 months ago, and then now you're just catching up, you're investing backwards, because usually by the time you get that commander to max, like a better version of that commander or a better commander for that troop type will come out, and then you're kind of scrambling to catch up, right? But if you are ahead, so a lot of these gold head hoarders that have like 1,000, 1,400, 2,000 plus gold heads, really, if you're just looking out for what I presented as the open field meta earlier, best bet to benefit your ball, but also your side on the field, bench Hua and invest in Belly. Like it hurts to say it. It almost feels kind of weird to say it, but if you're looking at just like the actual overall benefit of the commander and then the march onto the field, I think Hua is a selfish march. I think his reports look good, but he doesn't really do much. At least Nevsky is even tankier, right? But also he has that damage reduction debuff. Like Hua just brings almost nothing. So that's my opinion on it. Obviously other people have different opinions. Again, if you watch all the way to the end, this is a lot of information packed into like 20 something minutes. If you haven't yet, please like and subscribe. Also, if you have any comments, obviously please leave it in the comment section. And then if you do have any questions, my info is in the details. And thank you for watching to the end, and I'll talk to you guys next time.